The saloon doors swung open with a violent crack as Ruby Fisher stormed inside, her emerald eyes flashing with fury beneath the shadow of her wide-brimmed hat, the whispers that had plagued her for weeks following in her wake like a relentless dust devil. Roswell, New Mexico Territory, 1885, was proving to be a town with an unquenchable thirst for scandal, and thanks to her stepmother's venomous lies, Ruby had unwittingly become its main attraction. "There she is," a woman whispered loudly enough for Ruby to hear. "The one who tried to seduce her own stepfather." Ruby's spine stiffened as she made her way to the bar, ignoring the sidelong glances and hushed conversations. At 22, she'd endured more than her fair share of hardship, but nothing compared to the malicious campaign her stepmother Vivian had waged against her since her father's death 3 months prior. "Whiskey," she said to the bartender, who hesitated before sliding a glass across the weathered wood. "Your money ain't good here, Miss Fisher," he said, pulling the glass back. "Mr. Holloway's orders." "On what grounds?" Ruby demanded, though she already knew the answer. "We don't serve women of questionable virtue," he replied, not meeting her gaze. Before Ruby could respond, a deep voice cut through the tension like a knife. "The lady asked for a drink, Simmons. I suggest you pour it." Every head in the saloon turned toward the newcomer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. His dark hair curled beneath his hat, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. Ruby recognized him instantly. Rhett Abernathy, the rancher who'd purchased the neighboring property 6 months ago. The bartender shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Abernathy, sir," Mr. Holloway specifically said. "I don't give a damn what Holloway said," Rhett replied, his voice deceptively soft as he placed a silver dollar on the bar. "The lady will have her whiskey, and so will I." Simmons hesitated only a moment longer before pouring 2 drinks. Ruby nodded stiffly at Rhett, unsure whether to thank him or maintain her distance. His unexpected defense surprised her, but experience had taught her to be wary of supposedly gallant men. "I don't need your charity, Mr. Abernathy," she said quietly. A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's not charity, Miss Fisher. It's common decency, something this town seems to be running short on lately." Ruby took a sip of her whiskey, welcoming the burn that traveled down her throat. "Common decency won't change what people believe about me." "Perhaps not," Rhett agreed, "but the truth might." Ruby's laugh was bitter and brief. "Truth is a luxury I can't afford right now. My stepmother has seen to that." Rhett studied her for a long moment. "I've never been one to put much stock in gossip, Miss Fisher. I prefer to form my own opinions." Before Ruby could respond, the saloon doors opened again, and a hush fell over the room. Vivian Fisher glided in, her expensive silk dress rustling with each deliberate step. At 40, she remained strikingly beautiful, with golden hair piled elegantly atop her head and a face that betrayed no hint of her malicious nature. "Ruby," she said, her voice honeyed with false concern, "I didn't expect to find you here, of all places." Her gaze flicked dismissively to Rhett before returning to her stepdaughter. "Though perhaps I shouldn't be surprised given your inclinations." Ruby's fingers tightened around her glass. "What do you want, Vivian?" "I've come to speak with Mr. Holloway about the charity auction," Vivian replied smoothly. "But now that I've found you, I feel I should remind you that decent young ladies don't frequent establishments such as this. What would your poor father say if he could see you now?" "My father would wonder why his widow is so intent on destroying his daughter's reputation," Ruby replied, her voice steady despite the rage boiling inside her. Vivian's smile tightened. "Always so dramatic, dear. I'm merely concerned for your welfare." She turned to the room at large. You must all forgive my stepdaughter. She's been unstable since her father's passing. We're doing everything we can to help her, but she refuses our guidance." Ruby stood so abruptly that her chair toppled backward. "You're a liar, Vivian. You always have been. See what I mean?" Vivian sighed theatrically. "Such outbursts. It's exactly this sort of behavior that concerns us." "I believe the lady asked what you wanted," Rhett interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. "And it seems you've said your piece. Perhaps it's time you moved along to your appointment with Holloway." Vivian's eyes narrowed as she assessed Rhett. "I don't believe we've been introduced, Mr. Abernathy. Rhett Abernathy. Ah, the new rancher. I've heard about you." Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "You should be careful about the company you keep, Mr. Abernathy. My stepdaughter has a history of entangling men in uncomfortable situations." Rhett's expression remained impassive. "I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Fisher, but I'm quite capable of judging character for myself." "As you wish." Vivian's gaze returned to Ruby. "Sheriff Dawson asked me to remind you that the deed to your father's shop needs to be transferred by the end of the week, unless, of course, you've reconsidered my husband's generous offer." Ruby's heart sank. Her stepmother had remarried with indecent haste after her father's death, wedding Harrison Burke, one of the wealthiest men in the territory. Now, they were using every legal means to wrest control of her father's gunsmith shop from her, the only inheritance she had left. "That shop is mine," Ruby said through clenched teeth. "Father's will was clear." "Was it?" Vivian replied innocently. "Because Sheriff Dawson seems to think otherwise. Something about improper documentation. Such a shame." With a final pointed smile, she swept out of the saloon, leaving a wake of whispers behind her. Ruby sank back into her chair, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for her whiskey. "You all right?" Rhett asked quietly. "I'm fine," she lied, downing the rest of her drink in one swallow. "This isn't anything new." Rhett signaled for another round. "How long has she been spreading these rumors about you?" "Since the day after my father's funeral," Ruby replied bitterly. "First it was that I was mentally unstable, then that I had stolen from the shop, then that I had inappropriate feelings for my stepfather." She shook her head in disgust. "As if I could stand the sight of Harrison Burke. The man's been trying to buy my father's shop for years." "And now he's married to your stepmother instead," Rhett observed. "Convenient, isn't it?" Ruby took a smaller sip of her fresh whiskey. "They make a perfect pair. Both of them are vultures." Rhett leaned forward slightly, his voice lowered. "What's so special about your father's shop that they want it so badly?" Ruby hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to this virtual stranger who had unexpectedly come to her defense. But something about Rhett Abernathy's steady gaze made her want to trust him, despite her better judgment. "It's not just a shop," she explained. "It's the best gunsmith business in 3 territories. My father built it from nothing. He taught me everything he knew: how to repair firearms, how to improve them, how to craft custom pieces that sell for small fortunes." Pride crept into her voice. "I've been working at his side since I was 12 years old. That shop is my life. And legally, it's yours. It should be. Father's will left everything to me. But suddenly there are problems with the documentation. Sheriff Dawson is in Burke's pocket, just like Judge Williams and half the town council." Ruby's shoulders slumped. "They're going to take it from me one way or another." Rhett was silent for a moment, contemplating his drink. "What if someone spoke up for you? Someone who could vouch for your character?" Ruby laughed humorlessly. "Like who?" "I've lived in Roswell my entire life, but after 3 months of Vivian's poison, my oldest friends crossed the street to avoid me. No one wants to stand against the Burkes. They have too much power here." "I'll stand with you," Rhett said simply. Ruby stared at him in disbelief. You barely know me. I know enough, he replied. I know that a woman who's worked her whole life to learn a trade like gunsmithing isn't likely to throw it away on foolish behavior. I know that a person who speaks of their father with such respect isn't likely to dishonor his memory. And I know that your stepmother has the eyes of a rattlesnake about to strike. Despite everything, Ruby felt a smile tug at her lips. You're observant, Mr. Abernathy. Rhett, he corrected gently. And yes, I try to be. My father always said you can tell a lot about folks by watching how they treat others when they think no one important is looking. Ruby nodded, thinking of how Vivian transformed from sweet widow to cunning manipulator depending on her audience. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, Rhett agreed, a shadow of grief crossing his features before he continued. Miss Fisher, Ruby, she interrupted. If I'm calling you Rhett, then you should call me Ruby, he nodded. Ruby, then, I meant what I said. I'll help you fight for your shop, but first I need to hear your side of the story, all of it. Ruby glanced around the saloon where curious eyes still watched them. Not here. My wagon's outside, Rhett offered. I could drive you home. Ruby hesitated, weighing her options. The prospect of walking home alone, facing more whispers and stares, was hardly appealing. And despite having just met Rhett Abernathy, she found herself wanting to trust him, a dangerous feeling perhaps, but one she couldn't quite shake. All right, she decided. But I should warn you, being seen with me won't do your reputation any favors. Rhett stood and offered her his arm, his expression determined. Let them talk. I've never much cared what small minds think of me. As they left the saloon together, Ruby was acutely aware of the eyes following them, the hushed conversations that would soon spread throughout Roswell. But for the first time in months, she didn't feel quite so alone in her battle against her stepmother's lies. Rhett's wagon was a sturdy, well-maintained vehicle with 2 strong horses that stood patiently in the late afternoon sun. He helped Ruby climb onto the seat with a gentle hand at her elbow, then circled around to take the reins. Where to? He asked as he settled beside her. Fisher Gunsmith's shop, Ruby replied. On Pine Street. I've been living in the rooms above it since. She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the painful memory of her father's death. Rhett nodded and set the horses in motion with a click of his tongue. They traveled in companionable silence for a few minutes, the rhythmic clop of hooves against packed dirt oddly soothing after the tension of the saloon. Thank you, Ruby said finally, her voice soft. For what you did back there. Not many would stand up to Vivian these days. Rhett kept his eyes on the road. I've never had much patience for bullies, regardless of how pretty they might be or how much money they have. She wasn't always like this, Ruby found herself saying. When she first married my father 5 years ago, she was different, charming even. She made him happy, and after my mother died, that was all I wanted for him. What changed? Ruby sighed. I'm not entirely sure. Over time, she became more controlling, more concerned with social status. When father refused to sell the shop to Harrison Burke last year, despite Vivian's urging, something shifted between them. And then, after he died. How did your father die? Rhett asked gently. Heart failure, they said. Ruby's voice tightened with emotion. He was only 48 and had never been sick a day in his life, but apparently his heart just stopped. Rhett glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. And you have doubts about that diagnosis? I don't know what to believe anymore, Ruby admitted. The timing was certainly convenient for Vivian and Burke, but I have no proof of anything untoward. They turned onto Pine Street, where Fisher Gunsmith's shop stood proud among the other businesses, a 2-story brick building with large display windows, and a hand-carved wooden sign that had been Ruby's gift to her father on the shop's 10th anniversary. Rhett pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the shop. This is quite an establishment. Your father built this himself. Pride swelled in Ruby's chest. From nothing. He came to Roswell in '65, right after the war, with nothing but his tools and his knowledge. Now, I have customers from as far as Denver and San Francisco. Rhett helped her down from the wagon, his touch respectful but firm. As Ruby's boots touched the ground, she noticed Sheriff Dawson approaching from down the street, his expression darkening when he spotted her with Rhett. "Miss Fisher," Dawson said, tipping his hat with mock politeness. "I see you found yourself a new friend." Ruby straightened her spine. "Sheriff Dawson, have you come about the deed again? Because my answer remains the same. I won't sell to the Burkes." Dawson's smile was cold. "Actually, I'm here on official business. There's been a complaint about inappropriate items being sold from your establishment." "What?" Ruby exclaimed. "That's absurd. We sell firearms, ammunition, and hunting supplies. The same inventory we've carried for 15 years. "Nevertheless, I'll need to inspect the premises," Dawson insisted, his hand resting suggestively on his holster. "Unless you have something to hide." Rhett stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Ruby. "Under whose authority are you conducting this search, Sheriff?" "Do you have a warrant?" Dawson's eyes narrowed. "I don't believe we've met." "Rhett Abernathy. I own the Diamond R Ranch south of town." "Ah, the newcomer." Dawson's tone suggested this was not a positive distinction. "This doesn't concern you, Mr. Abernathy." "This is official business between Miss Fisher and the law." "Then I'll repeat my question," Rhett said evenly. "Do you have a warrant?" Dawson's jaw tightened. "I don't need one when there's reasonable suspicion of illegal activity." "What illegal activity?" Ruby demanded. "Who made this complaint?" "I'm not at liberty to say," Dawson replied, though his smug expression told her everything she needed to know. This was just another of Vivian's tactics, executed through her new husband's influence over the sheriff. "If you're going to search my property without a warrant," Ruby said firmly, "then I want witnesses present. Independent witnesses." "That won't be necessary," Dawson began. "I disagree," Rhett interrupted. "And as a property owner and taxpayer in this county, I volunteer to serve as one such witness. Shall we find another? Or would you prefer to return with proper documentation?" Dawson's face reddened. "You're new here, Abernathy, so I'll give you some friendly advice. Be careful who you align yourself with. The Fisher girl has a reputation based on what evidence?" Rhett challenged. "Hearsay and gossip don't constitute proof where I come from, Sheriff." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the confrontation. Ruby recognized Mrs. Landry from the millinery shop next door and old Pete, who ran the livery stable across the street. Both had been friends of her father's, though they'd been avoiding her since the rumors began. Dawson glanced at the growing audience and appeared to reconsider his approach. "Fine. I'll return with the proper documentation. But mark my words, Miss Fisher, one way or another this charade of yours will end. That shop will be in proper hands soon enough." As the sheriff stalked away, Ruby let out a shaky breath. "Thank you. Again. That's twice today you've come to my defense." Rhett turned to face her, his expression grave. "This isn't just about the shop, is it? They're trying to drive you out of town completely." Ruby nodded, suddenly exhausted. "Vivian wants me gone. She always has. I was just an inconvenient reminder that my father had a life before her." She glanced at the curious onlookers who were still watching them. "Would you like to come inside? I could make coffee and, well, I owe you that explanation." Rhett nodded. "I'd appreciate that." As Ruby unlocked the shop door, she was acutely aware of the whispers behind them, the judgmental stares of townspeople who had once greeted her warmly but now viewed her with suspicion. Let them talk, she thought defiantly. For the first time in months, she had an ally, and she wasn't going to waste the opportunity. The interior of the shop was immaculate, with gleaming glass display cases showcasing an impressive array of firearms. Rifles hung on racks along one wall, while a large workbench dominated the rear of the space, its surface covered with tools and half-assembled mechanisms. "This is quite a collection," Rhett remarked, admiring a finely crafted revolver in one of the cases. "That's one of mine," Ruby said, unable to hide her pride. "Modified Colt single-action army. I improved the trigger mechanism and added custom grips." She hesitated, then added, "My father always said I had a better eye for detail than he did." Rhett looked up at her with genuine respect. "You made this?" Ruby nodded, unlocking a door beside the workbench that led to a narrow staircase. "The living quarters are up here. It's not much, but it's home." The apartment above the shop was small but comfortable, with a combined kitchen and sitting area, a small bedroom visible through an open door, and a window that overlooked the main street. Ruby busied herself with the coffee pot while Rhett settled at the pine table, removing his hat and placing it beside him. "So," he said when she had joined him with 2 steaming cups, "tell me how all this started. What happened after your father died?" Ruby wrapped her hands around her cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "It was about a week after the funeral. I was in the shop, trying to catch up on orders. Father had been teaching me the business since I was a child, so I knew how to handle everything. But Vivian came in with Harrison Burke and announced that they were getting married. A week after your father's funeral," Rhett's brow furrowed. "Exactly. I was shocked, of course. Angry. I accused her of disrespecting my father's memory." Ruby's grip on her cup tightened. "She claimed they had been in love for years, that my father knew about their relationship and had given them his blessing." "Did you believe her?" Ruby shook her head emphatically. "Never. My father was an honest man. He would never have tolerated such deception." She took a sip of her coffee. "I told her as much, and that's when she changed. Her entire demeanor, it was like a mask dropping away. She told me that with my father gone, there was no longer any need to pretend she cared about me. And that's when the rumors started, not right away. First, she and Burke tried to buy the shop from me, offered what seemed like a generous sum. When I refused, Burke suggested that I might not be mentally equipped to handle the business on my own, that perhaps the stress of my father's death had affected my judgment." "And the townspeople believed that?" Rhett asked incredulously. Ruby smiled bitterly. "Burke owns the bank, the mercantile, and has investments in nearly every business in town. When he suggests something, people listen. But that wasn't enough for Vivian. When it became clear I wouldn't sell, the rumors became more personal." She stared into her coffee, struggling to maintain her composure. "She told people I had made advances toward Burke, that I had become unhealthily attached to him after my father's death, that I was mentally unstable, prone to delusions and fits of hysteria. And the townspeople believed her over you." Rhett's voice contained barely controlled anger. "Vivian has always been charming when she wants to be," Ruby explained. "She plays the grieving widow beautifully. And she's careful she doesn't spread the worst rumors directly. She hints, suggests, lets others draw their own conclusions. By the time the stories reached me, they had grown far beyond anything she might have initially implied." Ruby stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare down at the street below. "Within a month, former friends wouldn't speak to me. Customers stopped coming to the shop. The bank called in a loan my father had taken for new equipment." She turned back to face Rhett. "They're suffocating me slowly, cutting off every avenue of support until I have no choice but to sell and leave Roswell." Rhett was silent for a long moment, considering her words. "Have you thought about leaving, starting fresh somewhere else?" "Every day," Ruby admitted. But this shop is all I have left of my father. It's my legacy as much as his, and if I leave, Vivian wins. She gets exactly what she wants. What do you think she wants? Just the shop? Ruby returned to the table, her expression troubled. I don't know. Initially, I thought it was just about the business, it's profitable, and Burke has wanted to add it to his holdings for years. But sometimes I wonder if there's something else, something I'm missing. Rhett leaned forward, his gray eyes intent. What does your instinct tell you? That there's something in this shop that they want, something specific. Ruby shook her head in frustration. But I've been through everything. Every drawer, every ledger, every hidden compartment I know of, and I know them all. If there's something valuable here beyond the business itself, I haven't found it. Rhett nodded thoughtfully. Your father's death, you mentioned it seemed convenient. Do you think a sharp knock at the door downstairs interrupted him? Ruby tensed, her heart racing. That might be Dawson back with his warrant. Let me handle this, Rhett said, rising from the table. If it is the sheriff, he'll have to deal with me first. Together they descended the stairs, Ruby's anxiety growing with each step. When she unlocked the shop door, however, it wasn't Sheriff Dawson who stood there but Thomas Graham, the town's attorney and one of the few people who had remained civil to Ruby despite the rumors. Miss Fisher, Graham said, removing his hat. I apologize for the intrusion, but I've just come from a meeting with Judge Williams that I believe concerns you. Mr. Graham, Ruby replied, stepping aside to let him enter. This is Rhett Abernathy. Graham nodded in acknowledgement before continuing grimly. I'm afraid I have troubling news. Judge Williams has signed an order freezing all business transactions related to Fisher Gunsmith until ownership can be legally determined. Ruby felt as if she'd been struck. What? On what grounds? Harrison Burke has filed a petition claiming that your father verbally promised to sell him the business before his death, Graham explained. He claims to have witnesses who will testify to this effect. That's a lie, Ruby exclaimed. My father would never sell to Burke. Everyone knew they were rivals. Graham looked uncomfortable. Be that as it may, Judge Williams has granted a temporary injunction. You cannot sell any inventory or conduct business until a hearing can be held next week. Rhett stepped forward. This is clearly harassment, Mr. Graham. Surely you can see that. I can see many things, Mr. Abernathy, but my personal opinions don't change the legal reality. Graham turned back to Ruby. I'm sorry, Miss Fisher. I thought you should hear this from me rather than the sheriff. Thank you, Ruby said mechanically, her mind racing. A week without business would be devastating to her already precarious finances. Is there anything I can do? Find those witnesses who can contradict Burke's claim, Graham advised. And be careful. Burke is a powerful man, and he doesn't take defeat gracefully. With a sympathetic nod, he departed, leaving Ruby and Rhett alone in the rapidly darkening shop. Ruby sank onto a stool behind the counter, her legs suddenly unable to support her. They're going to take everything, she whispered. Rhett's expression hardened with determination. No, they're not. Not if I have anything to say about it. What can you possibly do? Ruby asked, despair creeping into her voice. I can start by telling everyone in this town exactly what I think of their willingness to believe malicious gossip over the evidence of their own eyes, Rhett declared. And then I'm going to help you find out what Burke and your stepmother are really after. Ruby looked up at him, confusion mingling with a fragile hope. Why would you do that? You barely know me. Rhett moved closer, his presence somehow both commanding and comforting. Because I know injustice when I see it. Because my father raised me to stand up for what's right, especially when it's difficult. He paused, a hint of vulnerability showing through his determined exterior. And because there's something about you, Ruby Fisher, that makes me think you're worth fighting for. In that moment, looking into Rhett Abernathy's steadfast gray eyes, Ruby felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of genuine hope. It was dangerous, perhaps, to place her trust in this man she barely knew. But as darkness fell over Roswell, bringing with it the prospect of another lonely night battling her stepmother's schemes, Ruby made her decision. "All right, Mr. Abernathy," she said, straightening her shoulders. "Let's fight back." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the New Mexico sun already promising another scorching day as Ruby opened the shop out of habit, despite the injunction against conducting business. She had spent a restless night pondering Rhett's words, and the strange turn her life had taken since meeting him. True to his word, Rhett arrived early, riding a magnificent black stallion that pawed impatiently at the ground as he dismounted. "Good morning," he called, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I've been thinking about your situation." Ruby couldn't help but smile at his directness. "Good morning to you too, Rhett. Would you like some coffee before you save my business?" A grin broke across his face, transforming his serious features. "Coffee would be appreciated. I've been riding since dawn." In the kitchen above the shop, Ruby poured 2 cups of strong coffee and set out some freshly baked biscuits. "You mentioned you've been thinking," she prompted as Rhett took a grateful sip. "Yes. I think we need to understand exactly what Burke and your stepmother are after," he replied. "You said yourself that it might be more than just the business." Ruby nodded. "But I've searched everywhere." "Sometimes an outsider's perspective helps," Rhett suggested. "Would you show me around the shop? The whole building, including any storage areas or places your father might have kept important items." After breakfast, Ruby led Rhett through a thorough exploration of the gunsmith shop, explaining her father's organizational system and pointing out the special features he had incorporated into the building's design. "Father was always concerned about theft," she explained as she showed Rhett a hidden compartment beneath the workbench. "He built secret storage throughout the shop for valuable components and finished pieces." "Smart man," Rhett commented, examining the craftsmanship of the hidden drawer. "What about paperwork? Where did he keep contracts, designs, that sort of thing?" Ruby led him to a heavy iron safe in the corner of the workshop. "Everything important is in here. Financial records, custom design specifications, special orders." She hesitated, then added, "I have the only key." Rhett raised an eyebrow. "Vivian doesn't have access." "No, Father was very protective of his designs. Some of them are quite valuable innovations that other gunsmiths would pay handsomely for." "Could that be what they are after?" Rhett asked. "Your father's designs," Ruby considered this. "Possibly, but why not just offer to buy them from me? Why go through this elaborate scheme to discredit me?" "Maybe because they know you wouldn't sell," Rhett suggested. "Or maybe there's something specific they want, something they don't want anyone to know they have." Ruby's brow furrowed as she contemplated this possibility. "Like what?" Before Rhett could respond, the shop door opened and they heard footsteps on the wooden floor. "Ruby, are you here?" called a feminine voice. Ruby tensed, then relaxed slightly as she recognized the speaker. "In the workshop, Thea." A young woman appeared in the doorway, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat, her expression anxious. "I just heard about the injunction. I came as soon as I could." "Rhett, this is Thea Collins, my closest friend, or at least the only one who hasn't abandoned me completely," Ruby said with a hint of bitterness. "Thea, this is Rhett Abernathy." Thea's eyes widened slightly as she took in Rhett's imposing figure. "The rancher, I've heard about you." She turned back to Ruby. "People are saying he defended you at the saloon yesterday, against Vivian." "People need to mind their own business," Ruby muttered. "That's never going to happen in Roswell," Thea replied with a small smile. "But I'm glad someone finally stood up to that woman." The things she's been saying about you." She shook her head in disgust. Rhett studied Thea with interest. "You don't believe the rumors, then?" "Of course not," Thea declared loyally. "I've known Ruby since we were children. The idea that she would do any of the things Vivian has implied is absurd." She reached for Ruby's hand. "I'm sorry I haven't been around more, my father." She trailed off uncomfortably. "Your father depends on Burke's business," Ruby finished for her. "I understand, Thea. You don't need to explain." Thea's father owned the town's only print shop, which relied heavily on orders from Burke's various businesses. Her loyalty to Ruby had already caused tension in her family, a fact that made Ruby both grateful for her friendship and guilty for the trouble it caused. "Well, I don't care what my father says," Thea declared firmly. "I know you, and I know you're innocent of everything Vivian has accused you of." "Thank you," Ruby said softly. "That means more than you know." Rhett cleared his throat. "Miss Collins, as someone who's known the Fisher family for years, do you have any insight into why Burke might be so determined to acquire this shop? Beyond the obvious business advantages." Thea hesitated, glancing at Ruby. "I'm not sure, but I did overhear something strange about a month ago. My father was printing some documents for Mr. Burke land deeds, I think, and Burke came to collect them personally. While he was waiting, Sheriff Dawson arrived to speak with him. I was in the back room and they didn't realize I could hear them." "What did they say?" Ruby asked eagerly. "Dawson mentioned something about Fisher's legacy and asked if Burke had found it yet. Burke seemed angry and said, 'That stubborn girl has no idea what she's sitting on. Once we get control of the shop, we can take our time searching properly.'" Thea's expression grew troubled. "I didn't understand what they meant at the time, but after everything that's happened." Ruby and Rhett exchanged a significant look. "So there is something specific they are after," Rhett said. "But what?" Ruby wondered aloud, frustration evident in her voice. "What could possibly be valuable enough to justify all this?" A thoughtful silence fell over the workshop as all three contemplated this question. Finally, Rhett spoke. "When did your father buy this building, Ruby?" "In '68, she replied. "He rented space for the first few years after arriving in Roswell, then purchased this place when the previous owner decided to move to California." "And who was the previous owner?" Ruby thought for a moment. "A man named Harrington. He ran a general store, I believe." Rhett nodded slowly. "And the building itself, has it always been as it is now, or did your father make changes to it?" "Oh, he made several changes," Ruby answered, beginning to see where Rhett was heading. "He expanded the workshop, added the display area in front, reinforced the floors to support the weight of the heavy equipment." "What about before that?" Rhett pressed. "Do you know the building's history before Harrington owned it?" Ruby shook her head. "Not really. I was very young when we moved in." "I might be able to help with that," Thea offered. "The town records are kept in my father's shop, building histories, property transfers, that sort of thing." "Could you access those records without your father knowing?" Rhett asked. Thea smiled slyly. "Easily. He's completely disorganized. I'm the one who keeps track of everything anyway." "Then that's our first step," Rhett decided. "We need to learn everything we can about this building's history. If there's something hidden here, understanding the building's past might help us find it." As Thea prepared to leave for the print shop, Ruby felt a renewed sense of purpose. For months, she had been on the defensive, reacting to each new attack from Vivian and Burke. Now, with Rhett's help, she was finally taking action. "Be careful," she warned Thea. "If my stepmother discovers you're helping me." "Let me worry about Vivian Fisher," Thea replied confidently. "That woman doesn't scare me." After Thea departed, Ruby turned to find Rhett examining the shop's foundation with keen interest. "What are you looking for?" she asked. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. But buildings this old often have secrets, false walls, hidden chambers, concealed cellars. He ran his hand along the brick wall behind the workbench. Your father was clearly a man who valued security and privacy. If there's something valuable hidden here, my guess is he would have created a special place for it. Ruby joined him, her fingers tracing the familiar contours of her father's workshop. I've lived here most of my life. I thought I knew every inch of this place. Sometimes the things closest to us are the easiest to overlook, Rhett said softly, his gray eyes meeting hers. For a moment, they stood in silence, the air between them charged with something Ruby couldn't quite name. The moment was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Ruby moved quickly to the window, her heart sinking as she saw Sheriff Dawson dismounting outside, accompanied by 2 deputies and Harrison Burke himself. "They're here," she said grimly. "Burke and the sheriff." Rhett's expression hardened. "Remember, they can't force you out without due process. The hearing isn't until next week." "They don't need to force me out if they can find a reason to arrest me," Ruby pointed out, her voice tight with anxiety. "Then we won't give them one," Rhett assured her. "Follow my lead." The shop door opened with a bang as Sheriff Dawson strode in, his hand resting ostentatiously on his holster. Harrison Burke followed, his expensive suit and gold watch a stark contrast to the working-class surroundings of the gunsmith shop. At 55, Burke was still a handsome man, with silver-streaked dark hair and cold blue eyes that assessed the room with calculating precision. "Miss Fisher," Dawson said without preamble, "I'm here to ensure you're complying with Judge Williams's injunction." Ruby lifted her chin. "As you can see, Sheriff, the shop is closed to customers. I'm simply attending to maintenance and inventory, which is well within my rights." Burke stepped forward, his gaze sliding dismissively over Ruby before settling on Rhett. "Mr. Abernathy, isn't it? I heard you've taken quite an interest in Miss Fisher's situation." "Mr. Burke," Rhett acknowledged with a curt nod. "I've taken an interest in justice, which seems to be in short supply in Roswell these days." Burke's smile was thin. "Justice is precisely what I seek. Thomas Fisher verbally agreed to sell me this business before his untimely death. I'm merely ensuring his wishes are honored." "That's a lie," Ruby said flatly. "My father would never have sold to you. Everyone who knew him knows that." "Such passion," Burke commented, his tone patronizing. "But I'm afraid your emotional attachment to this shop doesn't override legal considerations. I have witnesses who will testify to your father's intentions." "Paid witnesses, no doubt," Rhett remarked. Burke's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Be careful, Mr. Abernathy. Slander is a serious accusation. So is fraud," Rhett replied evenly. "And harassment, and abuse of power." The tension in the room was palpable as the 2 men stared at each other, neither willing to back down. Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably, his hand still hovering near his weapon. "We're not here to argue," Dawson interjected. "I'm conducting an official inspection to ensure no business is being transacted in violation of the court order." "Inspect away," Ruby said, gesturing broadly. "As you can see, there are no customers here, just Mr. Abernathy and myself." Dawson began a methodical search of the shop, opening drawers and examining the ledger book on the counter while his deputies stood guard at the door. Burke remained near the entrance, his calculating gaze roaming over the workshop's contents. "What exactly are you hoping to find, Sheriff?" Rhett asked, his tone conversational but his posture alert. "Surely Miss Fisher's ledger will show whether any sales have been made since the injunction." "I'm thorough, Mr. Abernathy," Dawson replied tersely. "It's part of my job." As the search continued, Ruby noticed Burke paying particular attention to the workshop area, his eyes lingering on the safe in the corner. A cold dread settled in her stomach. Whatever they were looking for, she was increasingly certain it had nothing to do with enforcing the injunction. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, Dawson finally appeared satisfied that no business had been conducted. "Everything seems to be in order," he announced reluctantly. "For now." Burke's expression betrayed a flicker of frustration before his composed mask returned. "Sheriff, perhaps we should also inspect the living quarters upstairs, to be thorough, as you said." Ruby stiffened. "That's my private residence, Mr. Burke. It has nothing to do with the business operations." "I'm afraid I must insist," Burke replied smoothly. "There could be business records kept there, inventory hidden away." "You need a separate warrant for that," Rhett cut in firmly. "The injunction applies to the business, not Miss Fisher's private home." Dawson hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to please Burke and his awareness of legal limitations. "He's right, Mr. Burke. We'd need specific authorization to search the living quarters." Burke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded. "Of course, we'll do this properly. No one can accuse us of overstepping our authority." He turned to Ruby, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Until the hearing, Miss Fisher, I do hope you'll reconsider my offer. It would be so much simpler for everyone." "I won't sell to you, Mr. Burke," Ruby replied steadily. "Not now, not ever." "We'll see," Burke said, his confidence unshaken. "Good day, Miss Fisher, Mr. Abernathy." With a nod to Dawson, he strode from the shop, the sheriff and his deputies following in his wake. When they were gone, Ruby released a shaky breath. "He's going to get that warrant. They'll be back." "Probably," Red agreed. "But by then, we might have some answers of our own." He moved to the window, watching as Burke and Dawson rode away. "He's desperate to find something specific. Did you see how he kept looking at that safe?" Ruby nodded. "He wants something my father had. Something valuable enough to justify all this effort. And we're going to find it first," Rhett declared with determination. "Whatever it is, it rightfully belongs to you." As the afternoon stretched into evening with no sign of Thea returning, Ruby's anxiety grew. She paced the small kitchen, occasionally glancing out the window at the darkening street below. She should have been back by now, she fretted. What if her father caught her searching the records? What if Vivian somehow found out she was helping us? Rhett, who had been examining the construction of the ceiling beams, paused to look at her. "Try not to worry. Miss Collins struck me as a resourceful young woman." "She is," Ruby agreed, "but so is my stepmother." As if summoned by their conversation, a knock came at the shop door downstairs. Ruby and Rhett exchanged a wary glance before descending together to answer it. When Ruby opened the door, she found Thea on the threshold, her face flushed with excitement, and a portfolio of papers clutched to her chest. "I found something," she announced breathlessly as she hurried inside. "Something important." Ruby quickly locked the door behind her. "What is it? What took you so long?" "I had to wait until my father left for his meeting with the town council," Thea explained, spreading the papers on the counter. "And then I had to be careful not to be seen copying these records." "But look," she pointed to a yellow document bearing an official seal. "This building wasn't always a general store before your father bought it. From 1850 to 1862, it was a station for the U.S. Army." Rhett leaned in, his interest piqued. "An Army station, here in Roswell." "Not just any station," Thea continued eagerly. "According to these records, it was a paymaster's office during the early territorial period. They dispersed funds to soldiers stationed throughout the region." "A paymaster's office would have needed a secure vault," Rhett mused, his eyes lighting with understanding. Ruby's heartbeat quickened. "A vault? You think there's a vault somewhere in this building?" "It would make sense," Rhett replied. and it would explain why your father chose this particular building for his gunsmith shop built in security for his valuable work. But where would it be? Ruby wondered, her mind racing through possibilities. I've never seen anything like a vault. Thea pulled out another document. According to the Army's specifications, the vault was constructed below ground level with access through the main office floor. The entrance was designed to be concealed when not in use. Ruby stared at the paper, recognition dawning. The workshop. The floor in the workshop has always been slightly uneven in one corner. Father said it was just settling of the building, but... She trailed off, already moving toward the workshop with newfound purpose. The three of them crowded into the workshop, where Ruby indicated a section of wooden flooring near the brick wall. Here, this area has always felt different underfoot. Rhett knelt to examine the planks, running his hands over the surface. These boards look the same as the others, but they're fitted slightly differently. He pressed experimentally at various points until a soft click sounded, and one edge of a section of flooring rose slightly. A hidden spring mechanism, he murmured appreciatively, carefully lifting the camouflage trapdoor to reveal a set of narrow stone steps descending into darkness. Your father maintained this mechanism all these years without telling you. Ruby stared into the shadowed opening, a complex mix of emotions washing over her. He must have had his reasons. She moved to a cabinet and retrieved a lantern, lighting it with steady hands despite her inner turmoil. Let's see what secrets my father kept. Rhett insisted on going first, taking the lantern and carefully navigating the steep stairs while Ruby and Thea followed closely behind. The air grew cooler and mustier as they descended into a small chamber with rough stone walls. Against the far wall stood a massive iron door, unmistakably a vault. "This must be what Burke is after," Thea whispered, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. Ruby approached the vault door, running her fingers over the cold metal. There was a heavy lock mechanism that required a key she didn't have. "How do we open it?" Red examined the lock carefully. "This is an old army vault, secure for its time but not impenetrable." He glanced at Ruby. "You said you're skilled with mechanical things. Could you pick this lock?" Ruby studied the mechanism with a professional eye. "Possibly. It would take time and the right tools, but..." She nodded slowly. "Yes, I think I could." "Then let's get started," Rhett said. "If Burke comes back with that warrant tomorrow, we need to know what's in there before he does." For the next few hours, Ruby worked meticulously on the vault lock, using precision tools from her gunsmithing equipment, while Rhett and Thea kept watch upstairs. The work was painstaking, requiring all her concentration and dexterity as she manipulated the internal components of the lock, feeling for the subtle resistance that would indicate progress. When the lock finally yielded with a satisfying click, Ruby sat back on her heels, exhaustion and triumph mingling in her expression. "I've got it." Rhett and Thea hurried down at her call, watching with anticipation as Ruby grasped the heavy iron handle and pulled. The door swung open with a protesting groan of metal, revealing a small, dusty chamber lined with wooden shelves. The lantern light illuminated the vault's contents. Several wooden boxes, stacks of yellowed papers, and a small iron chest. Ruby stepped inside cautiously, lifting the nearest box and placing it on the floor outside the vault. When she opened it, all three of them gasped. Inside lay rows of gold coins, their surfaces dull with age but unmistakably valuable. The next box contained similar treasure as did the one after that. "Army payroll," Rhett murmured, picking up one of the coins to examine it. "Must have been abandoned during the chaos of the Civil War." "There's a fortune here," Thea whispered, her eyes wide. "Enough to buy half the territory." Ruby opened the small iron chest last, finding it filled with official-looking documents. She lifted one carefully, squinting to read the faded ink. "Land grants," she said slowly. "These appear to be original territorial land grants signed by government officials in the 1850s. Rhett took one of the documents, his expression growing increasingly grave as he scanned its contents. "Ruby, you understand what these are? These are the original land grants for much of what is now Roswell and the surrounding area, including," he paused, the significance of his discovery evident in his voice, "all of the land currently claimed by Harrison Burke." Ruby stared at him, the implications slowly sinking in. "Are you saying—" "I'm saying that if these documents are authentic and they appear to be, they could potentially invalidate Burke's claim to much of his property." Rhett's eyes met hers. "This isn't just about your shop, Ruby. This is about Burke's entire empire." "No wonder he was so desperate to get his hands on this place," Thea said softly. "If these documents ever came to light, he'd lose everything," Ruby finished, a cold understanding washing over her. "And my father must have known. That's why he never told me about the vault he was protecting me." Rhett nodded grimly. "Your father discovers an abandoned army vault when he buys the building. Inside, he finds not only a fortune in gold but documents that could destroy the most powerful man in the territory. He keeps the secret, perhaps planning to use the information if necessary, but then dies suddenly before he can tell you. And Vivian somehow learns about it, either from my father before his death or by discovering evidence of the vault afterward," Ruby continued, the pieces falling into place. "She allies herself with Burke, marries him after my father's convenient death, and they begin their campaign to force me out and take control of the building. The question now," Rhett said soberly, "is what we do with this information." Ruby looked at the wealth spread before her, gold that technically belonged to the U.S. government and documents that could reshape the power structure of the entire region. The weight of the decision pressed on her like a physical burden. "We need to think carefully," she said finally. "These documents could give us leverage against Burke, but using them means revealing the vault's existence, which means surrendering the gold to the authorities. And potentially facing questions about why your father kept it hidden all these years," Rhett added. The three of them fell silent, each contemplating the complex moral and practical considerations of their discovery. Finally, Ruby began carefully repacking the boxes. "We need time to think, to plan our next move," she decided. "For now, let's keep this discovery between us. The hearing isn't until next week. We have a few days to determine the best course of action." As they ascended the stairs and carefully concealed the trapdoor once more, Ruby felt simultaneously burdened and liberated by their discovery. She finally understood what was driving her stepmother's ruthless campaign against her, and with that understanding came power. But with power came responsibility. And as Ruby looked at Rhett's thoughtful face in the lamplight, she realized that the path ahead would require not only courage but wisdom. The battle for her father's legacy had suddenly become much more complicated than a simple fight for a gunsmith shop. That night, after Thea had gone home with promises to return the next day, Ruby and Rhett sat in her small kitchen, discussing their options in low voices despite being alone. "You could simply take some of the gold and leave," Rhett suggested, though his tone indicated he already knew her answer. "Start fresh somewhere far from Vivian and Burke's influence." Ruby shook her head firmly. "That gold isn't mine to take, and running away would mean abandoning everything my father built, everything he stood for." She wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "No, I need to stay and fight, but I want to do it honorably." Rhett smiled slightly, a hint of admiration in his eyes. I expected nothing less from you. What would you do if you were in my position? Ruby asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. Rhett considered the question seriously. I'd use the documents as leverage, but not for personal gain. I'd use them to force Burke to withdraw his claim to your shop and to stop his campaign against your reputation. He paused, his gray eyes meeting hers directly. But I'd also ensure the gold was returned to its rightful owner, the government. It's the honest thing to do. Ruby nodded slowly. That's what my father would have wanted. He wasn't a thief. He must have had reasons for keeping the vault secret, but I can't believe he intended to keep the gold permanently. Perhaps he was waiting for the right time to report it, Rhett suggested. Or perhaps he was concerned about what would happen to the documents if the vault was discovered. The land grants, Ruby mused. They could cause chaos if revealed publicly. Land that's been bought and sold for decades suddenly called into question. Exactly. Your father might have been protecting the community as much as anything else. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door downstairs, a hesitant, almost furtive sound that immediately put them both on alert. It was well past 10 o'clock, too late for ordinary visitors. Stay here, Rhett said quietly, checking that his revolver was easily accessible as he moved toward the stairs. I'm coming with you, Ruby insisted, grabbing a small derringer from a drawer, one of her own custom designs, compact but deadly accurate at close range. Together they descended the stairs, moving silently in the darkness. When they reached the shop door, Rhett positioned himself to one side while Ruby called out, "Who's there?" "It's me, Miss Fisher, Elijah Moore." The voice was barely above a whisper. Ruby and Rhett exchanged a puzzled glance. Elijah Moore was Burke's personal secretary, a quiet, efficient man who rarely spoke to anyone outside his employer's immediate circle. Cautiously, Ruby unlocked the door, keeping her derringer ready as she opened it just wide enough to confirm the visitor's identity. Moore stood on the threshold, nervously glancing over his shoulder at the empty street. "Please, may I come in?" he asked urgently. "I shouldn't be seen here." Ruby hesitated, then stepped back to allow him entry. Rhett immediately closed and locked the door behind him, his hand remaining near his weapon. "What brings you here at this hour, Mr. Moore?" Ruby asked, lighting a lamp that cast long shadows across the shop floor. Moore removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and a face lined with strain. "I've come to warn you, Miss Fisher. Mr. Burke has obtained the warrant to search your living quarters. They'll be here at dawn." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. "And there's more. Mrs. Burke, your stepmother, she's convinced the sheriff to arrest you if they find anything suspicious." "On what charges?" Rhett demanded. "Theft, initially," Moore replied. "They plan to claim you've been selling inventory despite the injunction. But—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he needed to say next. "There's also talk of questioning your father's death." Ruby felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. "What do you mean, Mrs.? Burke has suggested to certain parties that your father's death may not have been natural, and that you had motivation to hasten his passing." Moore's voice dropped even lower. "She's laid groundwork for this accusation for months, hinting at your supposed instability, your desperation to control the shop." "That's monstrous," Rhett growled, his face darkening with anger. "Thomas Fisher died of heart failure. There was a doctor's examination." "Dr. Pembroke," Moore acknowledged, "who happens to owe Mr. Burke a considerable sum of money." Ruby gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "They would go that far, accuse me of murdering my own father, Mrs. Burke is remarkably thorough in her vendettas," Moore said simply. "I've worked for Mr. Burke for 7 years. I've never seen him so influenced by anyone as he is by your stepmother." "Why are you telling us this?" Rhett asked bluntly. "You're risking your position, possibly more." Moore straightened slightly, a flash of dignity breaking through his nervous demeanor. "Because I respected Thomas Fisher. He was an honest businessman in a territory that has too few, and because—" He hesitated before continuing, "because I know what Mr. Burke is capable of. I've helped him destroy other competitors, other lives. But this framing an innocent woman for murder, I cannot be part of it." Ruby studied Moore's face, seeing the genuine distress in his eyes. "Thank you for the warning, Mr. Moore," he nodded, already moving back toward the door. "They'll be here at dawn. Whatever you need to do, whatever you need to protect, you have until then." With those parting words, he slipped out into the night, the soft click of the lock behind him seeming unnaturally loud in the silent shop. Ruby turned to Rhett, her mind racing. "We don't have much time." Rhett's expression was resolute. "Then we need to move now. Get whatever personal items you can't bear to leave behind. I'll bring my wagon around to the back of the building." "Where are we going?" "To my ranch. It's the safest place for you right now. Once you're secure, I'll go to the territorial judge in Santa Fe. He's an honest man who owes me a favor. With these documents as evidence, we can get a legal order to stop Burke and your stepmother." Ruby hesitated, torn between the need to flee and her reluctance to abandon her home. "What about the gold, the documents?" "We'll take the most important documents with us," Rhett decided. "As for the gold, it's safer where it is for now. Burke doesn't know exactly what he's looking for or where it is. By the time he figures it out, we'll have legal protection in place." The decisiveness in his voice steadied Ruby. She nodded and hurried upstairs to gather her most precious possessions: her father's pocket watch, her mother's locket, the journal containing her own gunsmith designs, and a few essential clothing items. Everything else, she realized with a pang, might be lost to her forever once she fled. When she returned downstairs, Rhett had already retrieved the most damning land grant documents from the vault and carefully resealed the hidden entrance. He had also packed her most valuable tools and a selection of completed custom firearms that represented her finest work. "Your legacy," he said simply when she looked at him questioningly. "These prove your skill. No matter what happens here, you'll be able to start again." The thoughtfulness of his actions touched Ruby deeply. In the midst of crisis, this near stranger had thought not just of her immediate safety but of her future, her identity as a craftswoman. "Thank you," she whispered, unable to fully express her gratitude. Rhett's wagon appeared at the back entrance, and they swiftly loaded their precious cargo. As Ruby took one last look at the shop that had been her home for most of her life, a profound sadness washed over her, tempered by the steel of her resolve. "We'll be back," Rhett promised, seeming to read her thoughts. "This isn't surrender, it's strategy." Ruby nodded, forcing herself to turn away from the darkened windows of her father's legacy. "Let's go." The journey to Rhett's ranch passed in tense silence, both of them alert for any sign of pursuit. The pre-dawn darkness shrouded the landscape in shadow, the wagon's passage marked only by the soft creak of wheels and the rhythmic breathing of the horses. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of approaching dawn, Ruby caught her first glimpse of the Diamond R Ranch, a sprawling property nestled in a valley with a handsome two-story house, substantial barn, and various outbuildings. Even in the dim light, she could see it was well maintained, a testament to Rhett's industry and care. "It's beautiful," she said softly as they approached. "It's home," Rhett replied simply. "My father and I built it together after we came west." A shadow of old grief crossed his face briefly. "He died 2 years ago, heart failure like your father." Ruby looked at him with new understanding. That's why you've helped me, isn't it? You see something of your own story in mine. Perhaps, Red acknowledged, but there's more to it than that. He glanced at her, something unspoken in his gaze before turning his attention back to guiding the wagon toward the house. A lantern flickered to life on the porch as they approached, and an older man stepped outside, rifle ready but held non-threateningly. "It's me, Caleb," Rhett called out. The man immediately lowered his weapon. "You're back early, boss. Everything all right? We have a situation," Rhett replied as he brought the wagon to a halt. "This is Miss Ruby Fisher. She'll be staying with us for a while." Caleb, a weather-beaten man with kind eyes and a shock of white hair, nodded respectfully to Ruby. "Miss Fisher, welcome to Diamond R." "Thank you," Ruby replied, suddenly acutely aware of how this must appear arriving at a bachelor's ranch in the pre-dawn hours with her possessions hastily packed. As if sensing her discomfort, Rhett quickly added, "Miss Fisher will take the guest room in the east wing. Caleb, could you ask Mrs. Simmons to prepare it, and we'll need breakfast for 3. "Right away, boss." Caleb disappeared into the house, and moments later a plump, gray-haired woman emerged, her expression curious but welcoming. "Mrs. Simmons is my housekeeper," Red explained as he helped Ruby down from the wagon. "She and her husband Caleb have been with me since my father's time. They're completely trustworthy." Ruby nodded gratefully, relief washing over her at the presence of another woman. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Simmons. Any friend of Mr. Abernathy's is welcome here, dear," the older woman replied warmly. "Come inside now. You look dead on your feet." The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined, with solid, comfortable furniture, polished wooden floors, and carefully chosen decorations that spoke of taste rather than ostentation. Mrs. Simmons led Ruby to a pleasant bedroom with large windows overlooking a garden that would be beautiful in daylight. "Rest if you can, dear," the housekeeper advised. "I'll bring some hot water for washing, and there'll be breakfast when you're ready." Left alone, Ruby moved to the window, watching as the first rays of sunlight touched the distant mountains. By now, Burke and the sheriff would be at her shop, finding it empty, perhaps already beginning their search for the hidden vault. The thought brought a mixture of anxiety and grim satisfaction they might take her home, but they wouldn't find what they were truly seeking. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. Mrs. Simmons entered with a steaming pitcher of water and fresh towels. "Mr. Abernathy asked me to give you this as well," she said, placing a small revolver on the bedside table. "He said you'd know how to use it." Ruby smiled faintly. "Yes, I certainly do. Thank you, Mrs. Simmons." When the housekeeper had gone, Ruby washed away the dust of their journey and changed into fresh clothes, grateful for the small comforts that helped restore her sense of dignity. The revolver she examined with professional interest. It was one of her own designs, a piece she had sold several months ago to an anonymous buyer. Apparently, that buyer had been Rhett. Feeling somewhat restored, she made her way downstairs, following the scent of coffee and bacon to a bright dining room where Rhett sat at the table, studying the land grant documents they had brought from the vault. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting with a smile that sent an unexpected warmth through her. "You look better. Did you get any rest?" "Not yet," Ruby admitted, accepting the coffee Mrs. Simmons poured for her. "Too much on my mind." Rhett nodded in understanding. "I've been studying these documents. They're even more significant than I initially thought. These grants don't just affect Burke's property, they impact half the influential families in the territory." Ruby sipped her coffee, considering the implications. "No wonder my father kept them hidden. Revealing them could throw the entire region into chaos." "Exactly." Rhett spread one of the documents on the table. but used carefully, just the ones pertaining to Burke's main holdings, they give us powerful leverage. What's your plan? Ruby asked. I'll leave for Santa Fe immediately after breakfast, Rhett replied. Judge Harrington is a man of integrity. With these documents and your testimony, we can get an injunction against Burke and possibly even a warrant for his arrest if we can prove he knowingly pursued fraudulent land claims. And Vivian, what about her accusations against me? Rhett's expression hardened. If she suggested your father's death was anything but natural, that's slander of the most serious kind. Without evidence, she'll find herself facing legal consequences of her own. Ruby stared into her coffee cup, her thoughts tumultuous. It won't be easy. They're powerful, connected. Even with these documents, they could fight us for years. Then we'll fight for years, Rhett said simply. Some things are worth fighting for. His unwavering support moved Ruby deeply. In the midst of losing everything familiar, she had somehow found an ally whose determination matched her own. Why? She asked softly. Why are you doing all this for me? Rhett was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching hers. When I first saw you in that saloon, standing alone against your stepmother's lies, I recognized something in you, a courage, an integrity that's rare in this world. The more I've come to know you, the more I've. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The more I've admired you. The sincerity in his voice touched something in Ruby that had been dormant for too long, a cautious hope. A tentative yearning for connection that she had suppressed during her months of solitary struggle. Before she could respond, however, the sound of approaching riders drew their attention to the window. Are you expecting visitors? Ruby asked, tension immediately returning to her shoulders. Rhett was already on his feet, moving to the window with the fluid grace of a man accustomed to potential danger. His expression relaxed slightly as he recognized the approaching party. It's Thea Collins, with two others, a man and a woman I don't recognize. Ruby joined him at the window, relief washing over her as she identified the riders. That's Thea's father, Samuel Collins, and the woman is Margaret Lewis, the telegrapher's wife. They're friends of my father's, or they were, before Vivian's rumors turned them against me. Minutes later, Caleb ushered the three visitors into the dining room. Thea rushed immediately to Ruby, embracing her with evident relief. Thank goodness you're safe. When I heard the sheriff was at your shop at dawn with that dreadful warrant, I was so worried. Samuel Collins, a dignified man in his 50s with the ink-stained fingers of his printing profession, stepped forward more hesitantly. Miss Fisher, I owe you an apology. I allowed Burke's influence and your stepmother's insinuations to cloud my judgment. I should have known better. Margaret Lewis, a formidable woman with steel gray hair and piercing blue eyes, nodded in agreement. We've all behaved shamefully, allowing that woman to poison us against Thomas Fisher's daughter, but that ends today. Ruby stared at them in confusion. I don't understand. What's happened? Thea's eyes shone with vindicated satisfaction. Elijah Moore happened. After warning you last night, he went to my father with evidence letters between your stepmother and Harrison Burke, dating back months before your father's death. Love letters, Ruby, discussing how they would be together once your father was no longer an obstacle. Ruby felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. Are you saying? We're saying there's strong evidence that your stepmother and Burke conspired to murder your father, Samuel Collins stated bluntly. And then to frame you when you wouldn't cooperate with their plans for the shop. Moore brought these letters to my husband at the telegraph office late last night, Margaret Lewis explained. Edward sent wires to the territorial marshal and the district attorney in Santa Fe immediately. They should be arriving in Roswell today. Ruby sank into a chair, overwhelmed by this new information. My father was murdered, she whispered, the terrible suspicion she had harbored for months finally confirmed. They killed him for his shop for the vault. Rhett placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Did more indicate how they did it? Heart failure isn't easily induced. Poison, Samuel Collins replied grimly. According to Moore, Mrs. Burke Vivian had been administering small doses of some toxin in your father's evening tea for weeks, something that mimics heart disease in its effects. Moore overheard them discussing it after they thought he had left for the day. A wave of nausea washed over Ruby as she remembered her father's gradual decline in the weeks before his death, the fatigue, the occasional chest pains he had dismissed as indigestion. I should have seen it, she said, anguish in her voice. I should have known something was wrong. You couldn't have known, Rhett said firmly. No one did. They were careful, calculating, but now they'll face justice. Samuel Collins cleared his throat uncomfortably. There's more you should know, Miss Fisher. When the sheriff and Burke arrived at your shop this morning and found it empty, Burke became unhinged. He began tearing the place apart, searching for something with almost manic intensity. The vault, Ruby breathed. Perhaps, Collins agreed. Whatever it was, he was desperate to find it. When Sheriff Dawson suggested they might need more men to continue the search properly, Burke struck him, in front of witnesses. He struck the sheriff? Rhett asked incredulously. Margaret Lewis nodded. Knocked him unconscious with a paperweight from the counter. Then he started ripping up floorboards, breaking into display cases. It took 3 men to subdue him. He's been locked in a cell since dawn, raving about hidden treasures and documents that would destroy him. And Vivian? Ruby asked. My stepmother. A grim smile touched Margaret's lips. Arrested attempting to flee town with a substantial amount of cash and jewelry. Edward's last wire indicated she's being held pending the arrival of the territorial marshal. The enormity of these developments left Ruby speechless. In a matter of hours, the powerful enemies who had seemed untouchable were now in custody, their crimes exposed. She should have felt triumphant, vindicated, and part of her did. But mixed with that validation was a profound grief for her father, whose murder had been disguised as natural death, and for the months of pain and isolation she had endured at Vivian's hands. Rhett seemed to sense her complex emotions. Mr. Collins, Mrs. Lewis, your news changes our immediate plans. Instead of traveling to Santa Fe, we should return to Roswell to speak with the authorities when they arrive. And to secure the shop, Ruby added, finding her voice again. There's something there that needs to be protected, something that belongs to the government. Samuel Collins looked intrigued but didn't press for details. We came partially to warn you, but also to escort you back if you were willing. The town owes you a proper homecoming, Miss Fisher, free of malicious rumors. Ruby exchanged a glance with Rhett, seeking his opinion. He nodded encouragingly. It's time to reclaim your place in Roswell, he said softly. Your father's legacy and your own. The decision made, preparations for departure began immediately. As the others moved outside to ready the horses, Rhett held Ruby back for a moment, his expression serious. Before we go back, there's something I need to say, he began, a hint of uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. These past few days have been extraordinary in many ways, dangerous, yes, but also. He paused, seeming to search for the right words. Also what? Ruby prompted gently, her heart quickening at the intensity in his gray eyes. Clarifying, he said finally. I came to New Mexico seeking a fresh start after my father's death. I bought the ranch, began building a life, but something was missing. I didn't know what until I saw you in that saloon, standing up to your stepmother with such dignity and courage despite everything she'd done to you. Ruby felt a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the morning sunshine streaming through the windows. "Rhett, please, let me finish," he said quietly. "I don't know what the future holds. There will be difficult days ahead, legal battles, rebuilding your reputation, dealing with the revelation of your father's murder. But I want you to know that whatever comes next, I'll be beside you if you'll allow it." The simple, heartfelt declaration moved Ruby deeply. In Rhett Abernathy, she had found not just an ally but someone who saw her clearly, who valued her strength rather than viewing it as a threat. The connection between them, forged in crisis and tempered by shared purpose, felt more real than anything she had experienced before. "I would like that very much," she replied softly, allowing herself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing since that first moment in the saloon. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." The return journey to Roswell was markedly different from their midnight flight. Riding in broad daylight with a supportive escort, Ruby felt a strange mix of anxiety and determination. News of Burke's breakdown and arrest had evidently spread throughout the town. As their small procession passed along the main street, people emerged from shops and houses to watch, some with shame-faced expressions, others with open curiosity. Ruby held her head high, conscious of Rhett riding steadily beside her, his presence a bulwark against the stares and whispers. When they reached Fisher Gunsmith's shop, she was shocked by the visible damage: the front door hanging from one hinge, display cases shattered, merchandise strewn across the floor. "Burke did all this?" she asked, dismounting slowly, her gaze taking in the destruction of her family's business. "He was like a man possessed," Margaret Lewis confirmed, tearing up floorboards, knocking down shelves, searching for something with feverish intensity. Ruby exchanged a significant look with Rhett. "The vault seems likely," he agreed quietly. "Let's assess the damage and see if he found it." Inside, the destruction was even more extensive. Burke had apparently focused his frenzied search on the workshop area, where splintered floorboards and scattered tools created a chaotic landscape. But the hidden entrance to the vault, built with military precision and maintained meticulously by Thomas Fisher, had held its secret. The trapdoor remained concealed, its clever mechanism intact despite Burke's violent efforts. As Ruby surveyed the damage, a tall, distinguished man in a marshal's uniform entered the shop, accompanied by Sheriff Dawson, whose sullen expression and bruised face suggested his reluctant cooperation was not entirely voluntary. "Miss Fisher?" the marshal inquired, removing his hat respectfully. "I'm Marshal James Harrington, Territorial Authority. I understand you've been the victim of serious crimes." Ruby straightened her shoulders. "Yes, Marshal. My stepmother and Harrison Burke conspired to murder my father, and then to drive me from my home and business through slander and harassment." Marshal Harrington nodded gravely. "I've reviewed the evidence provided by Mr. Moore, including the letters between Mrs. Burke and her current husband. There's certainly cause for a formal investigation into your father's death and the subsequent events." He glanced around at the devastated shop. "And judging by the state of your property, Mr. Burke's actions this morning add substantial weight to the accusations. Will they remain in custody?" Rhett asked. "For now, yes. The charges are serious enough to warrant detention until a proper hearing can be arranged." The marshal turned his attention back to Ruby. "Miss Fisher, I understand from Mr. Collins that you have additional information relevant to this case, specifically regarding why Burke was so desperate to gain control of this building." Ruby hesitated, glancing at Rhett, who gave her a supportive nod. "Yes, Marshal. But what I have to show you involves more than just my personal situation. It has implications for the territorial government itself." With that cryptic statement, Ruby led the marshal, along with Rhett and Sheriff Dawson, to the workshop. Carefully activating the hidden mechanism, she revealed the concealed trapdoor and the stone steps descending to the vault below. Marshal Harrington's eyes widened in surprise. A hidden chamber. How long has this been here? Since the building was a military paymaster's office in the 1850s, Ruby explained, lighting a lantern to illuminate their way. My father discovered it when he purchased the property. What's inside explains why Burke was willing to commit murder to obtain it. The marshal's astonishment only grew as Ruby opened the vault door and revealed its contents, the boxes of gold coins and the remaining land grant documents. As she explained the significance of their discovery, particularly the implications of the original land grants for Burke's property holdings, understanding dawned on the lawman's face. This is why he was so desperate, Harrington murmured, examining one of the official documents. These grants could invalidate his claim to half his empire. He looked up at Ruby with newfound respect. And your father kept this hidden all these years. Why didn't he report it? Ruby shook her head. I don't know his exact reasoning, Marshal. He never told me about the vault. But knowing my father, I believe he was concerned about the chaos these documents might cause if revealed improperly. Land that's been bought and sold for decades suddenly called into question. It could destroy innocent families along with guilty ones like Burke. A wise concern, Harrington agreed. This will require careful handling at the highest levels of territorial administration. He carefully replaced the document. Miss Fisher, I commend your honesty in revealing this. Many might have been tempted to take the gold and disappear. It isn't mine, Ruby said simply. It belongs to the government, as do the documents. I only ask that when decisions are made regarding the land grants, consideration be given to those who purchased property in good faith, without knowledge of any irregularities in the chain of ownership. The marshal nodded. A reasonable request. I'll ensure it's conveyed to the governor along with my report. He straightened, his decision made. I'll post guards here until proper arrangements can be made for the transfer of these materials. In the meantime, Miss Fisher, I'll need a formal statement from you regarding your stepmother and Mr. Burke's activities. As they ascended from the vault, Marshal Harrington turned to Sheriff Dawson, whose expression had grown increasingly uncomfortable throughout their exploration. Sheriff, I believe we should discuss your role in these events. Your cooperation with the territorial investigation will be noted when determining whether you face charges for abuse of authority. Dawson paled visibly. I was just following orders, Marshal. Burke has a lot of influence in this town. That excuse has never carried much weight with me, Sheriff, Harrington replied coldly. We'll continue this discussion at your office. He turned back to Ruby. Miss Fisher, if you could come by later today to provide that statement. Of course, Marshal, Ruby agreed. After Harrington and the chastened Dawson departed, Ruby surveyed her devastated shop with a mixture of sadness and determination. It will take weeks to repair all this damage, she sighed. You won't have to do it alone, Rhett assured her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. I suspect you'll find many in Roswell suddenly eager to make amends for their treatment of you. As if to prove his point, the shop door opened to admit Samuel Collins and several other townsmen, including the blacksmith, the livery stable owner, and even Mr. Simmons from the saloon. Miss Fisher, Collins began, acting as spokesman for the group. We've come to offer our assistance in restoring your shop. It's the least we can do after failing to stand by you these past months. Tears pricked at Ruby's eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to show weakness even in this moment of vindication. Thank you. I would appreciate the help. For the remainder of the day, The shop buzzed with activity as volunteers cleared debris, repaired what could be salvaged, and made lists of what needed replacement. Word of Burke and Vivian's arrest, and the reasons behind it spread rapidly through Roswell, bringing more townspeople to offer assistance or simply to express their regret at having believed the rumors. By evening, the worst of the damage had been addressed. The shop was far from restored to its former state, but it was secure and partially functional. As the last of the volunteers departed with promises to return the next day, Ruby found herself alone with Rhett in the workshop, surveying their progress. "It's a start," she said, leaning against the workbench in exhaustion. "A week ago, I wouldn't have believed any of this possible." Rhett studied her with warm appreciation. "A week ago, you were fighting this battle alone. Now the whole town knows the truth." "Thanks to you," Ruby pointed out. "If you hadn't defended me that day in the saloon, I might have given up entirely." "I doubt that," Rhett countered with a smile. "You're not the type to surrender, Ruby Fisher. It's one of the many things I admire about you." The way he looked at her with genuine admiration mixed with something deeper, more personal, sent a flutter through Ruby's heart. In the chaos of the past few days, there had been little time to examine the growing connection between them, the natural understanding that had developed so quickly. "What happens now?" she asked softly, the question encompassing far more than just the practical considerations of rebuilding her shop and navigating the legal aftermath of Vivian and Burke's crimes. Rhett moved closer, his gray eyes intent on hers. "Now you rebuild. You reclaim your father's legacy and forge your own. You create the finest firearms in the territory, just as you were meant to do." "And you?" Ruby asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What will you do now that the crisis has passed?" "That depends," he replied, reaching out to take her hand gently in his, "on whether a certain stubborn, brilliant gunsmith might be interested in getting to know a humble rancher better, now that she's no longer in need of his protection." Ruby's heart swelled with emotions too complex to name: gratitude, affection, a growing tenderness, and something that felt dangerously like love. "I think she would be very interested in that," she answered, her smile matching his own. "Good," Rhett murmured, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with exquisite gentleness. "Because I find I'm not quite ready to return to my quiet ranch life just yet." As his lips met hers in a tender, questioning kiss, Ruby felt as if the final piece of a complex mechanism had slipped perfectly into place. In the midst of tragedy and triumph, she had found not just justice, but something she had never expected. A partner who saw her strength as an asset rather than a threat, who valued her independence even as he offered his unwavering support. When they finally parted, Ruby looked up into Rhett's eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future built on mutual respect and growing affection, on shared values and complementary strengths. It was a future worth fighting for, just as her father's legacy had been. "Stay," she whispered, making her decision. "Help me rebuild not just the shop, but everything." Rhett's smile was answer enough, but he said the words she needed to hear. "For as long as you want me, Ruby Fisher, I'll be right here beside you." In the years that followed, the story of Ruby Fisher and Rhett Abernathy became something of a legend in Roswell and beyond. The tale of how her stepmother's malicious lies had nearly destroyed her, and how a principled rancher had defended her when no one else would, was told and retold, gaining romantic embellishments with each telling. The truth, as Ruby and Rhett knew it, was both simpler and more profound than the stories. Their journey from strangers to allies to lovers had been forged in crisis, but built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine admiration. The discovery of the vault and its contents had indeed changed the course of territorial history. With careful application of the land grant documents, reshaping ownership patterns throughout the region, though Burke's fraudulent claims were the only ones fully invalidated, thanks to Ruby's insistence on protecting innocent landowners. Vivian Fisher Burke and Harrison Burke faced justice for their crimes, convicted not only of Thomas Fisher's murder but of conspiracy, fraud, and other charges that ensured they would spend the remainder of their lives in prison. Their downfall brought a measure of peace to Ruby, though the loss of her father remained a wound that would never fully heal. The Fisher gunsmith shop flourished under Ruby's expert guidance, its reputation for quality and innovation spreading far beyond New Mexico territory. When she and Rhett married a year after their first meeting, they expanded the business to include a branch at the Diamond R Ranch, where they made their primary home while maintaining the original shop in Roswell. Their partnership proved as successful in business as in life, with Rhett's practical ranch experience complementing Ruby's technical expertise. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Ruby's father, arrived 2 years into their marriage, followed by twin daughters who inherited their mother's fierce independence and their father's steady temperament. On the 5th anniversary of the day they met, Rhett presented Ruby with a special gift, a custom-designed revolver engraved with the words to RF, who faced down lies with truth and fear with courage. It became her most treasured possession, a tangible reminder of the day her life had changed forever. You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? Ruby asked Rhett that evening as they sat on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. If you hadn't spoken up that day in the saloon, Rhett considered the question, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. Sometimes. But I believe we would have found our way to each other eventually. Some things are simply meant to be. Ruby leaned into his embrace, contentment washing over her. From the darkest period of her life had come her greatest happiness, a loving husband, beautiful children, a thriving business, and a reputation built on truth rather than lies. Her stepmother's poisonous scheme had failed, defeated by one man's willingness to see beyond rumors to the woman beneath. "I'm glad you didn't believe the lies," she said softly. Rhett pressed a kiss to her temple. "I never did. Not for a moment." As the first stars appeared in the deepening twilight, Ruby Fisher Abernathy reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect peace. Her father's legacy lived on in her work and in her son, who already showed signs of inheriting the family talent. Her own legacy was still being written, day by day, in the life she and Rhett had built together. And if sometimes she thought of the malicious stepmother whose lies had nearly destroyed her, it was with the satisfaction of knowing that truth, though it might be temporarily obscured, would always eventually prevail, especially when defended by those with the courage to stand against the tide of gossip and fear. In Rhett's arms, watching their children play in the fading light of another day in the land they both loved, Ruby knew that she had found something far more precious than gold or land or even justice. She had found a home where she was valued for exactly who she was: strong, skilled, and uncompromising in her principles. It was, she reflected as Rhett's lips found hers in a tender kiss that still held the power to quicken her heartbeat after all these years, the greatest treasure of all.